You won't get a penny of the 40 million, you pauper. The insult rang out across the cathedral. The words sliced through the hushed air of St. Mary's like a lash. Even the organist paused, a note hanging in dissonance before fading into silence. Father O'Malley faltered mid-sentence, his hand tightening on the Bible as if unsure how to proceed. Conversations died instantly. All at once, the cathedral filled with nothing but the echo of Vanessa's voice, her tone sharp enough to pierce glass. I felt hundreds of eyes crawl over me. Some blinked in astonishment, others dropped quickly, unwilling to be caught staring. The silence was not protection, it was indictment. People would remember this moment, but not with pity. They would whisper of it later. How the old man in his threadbare suit was humiliated by the widow with diamonds on her wrists. My body stiffened. My instinct was to recoil, to lash back. But I forced my trembling hands flat against the seam of my trousers. This was Michael's funeral. My son's farewell was not the place for me to defend myself. Dignity was all I had left, and even that felt like it was slipping from my grasp. The cathedral was cold, the kind of damp chill that made bones ache. Outside, San Francisco's March sky pressed gray against the stained glass windows, muting their blues and reds into dull shadows. The smell of incense mingled with wilting flowers, and I could feel the hard wood of the pew biting into the back of my legs. I tried to fix my gaze on the altar, to block her out, but her words reverberated, clinging to every surface. Pauper, beggar, worthless. Vanessa Harper stood like a dark flame against the marble floor. Her dress was tailored to perfection, black silk catching every fragment of light. A brooch glittered at her collarbone, as if mocking the grief she hadn't shown. Her chin lifted, eyes cool, the corner of her mouth curved in disdain. She had chosen her stage carefully, and her audience did not disappoint. Not a soul moved to stop her. James Warren, Michael's business partner, shifted in his seat near the front. He turned, his face tight with conflict. His lips parted as if he might speak, but then he pressed them shut again, looking down at the floor. The gesture was small, fleeting, but I caught it, and it deepened the pit in my stomach. Father O'Malley tried to steady his voice. Let us remember Michael Harper for the love he gave and received, but even his words sounded thin, paper over a broken wall. Around me, I felt the congregation stir uneasily, whispers rushing like dry leaves. Yet no one challenged her. Not one word of defense. I clenched my jaw until it ached. Michael had lived a life of vision, of boldness. He had fought for ideas bigger than himself. And here, at the end, his father, the man who had built rockets in a garage with him, who had left behind dreams so the boy could chase his own, stood reduced to nothing in the eyes of those gathered. The climax of her cruelty was not in the insult itself, but in the silence that followed. That silence cut deeper than words, for it told me that humiliation could be public and yet remain unchallenged. It told me that grief offered no shield, that age and sacrifice carried no respect in this place. Blackmail my eyes to Michael's casket. Lilies draped in white cascaded over the polished wood, and beside it, his photograph gleamed with that familiar grin, a smile that once lit our modest home after long nights of study, a smile that had filled me with pride. Now it stared back, unchanging, as if to ask why I did not defend myself. My lips parted, but no sound came. I could not drag him into this ugliness. I could only endure. The choir began to sing again, thin voices trembling in the cold air. I heard nothing but the hammer of my own heart. My breath came shallow, my vision dimming at the edges. I had stood through years of hardship, raised Michael alone after his mother died, endured sacrifice without witness, but never before had I felt so naked, so stripped of worth as I did in that moment. Edward tightened his fist, and inside his mind a single thought whispered with aching weight. Roland, do you know what I gave up for you? Edward returned to the small house in Oakland, hung up his worn vest, and faced his son's empty chair. The chair sat at the kitchen table where Michael used to linger with late-night coffee, half-empty mugs scattered among textbooks and notebooks. Now it was only wood and silence, but the outline of him seemed etched into it, as if the absence itself carried weight. I stood there a long time, my hand brushing the backrest, listening to the quiet. The hum of the refrigerator was the only answer. The house, modest and plain, wrapped around me like a shell. A single-story dwelling built in the 1950s, paint fading, the floorboards creaking in familiar places. Its walls carried echoes of laughter, the sharp clang of tools from the garage, the muted sound of television in the evenings when it had been just the two of us. Tonight, every corner seemed hollow, reverberating with a question that had no answer. How does a man live without his son? I tried to breathe in calm, to find comfort in the artifacts of our life together. Photographs lined the hallway. Michael at Stanford graduation. Michael at 16 holding up a sketch of a rocket labeled Pauper Engineering. Dust edged the frames, but the images glowed with the pride I had felt then. They should have given me solace. Instead, the insult from the cathedral replayed mercilessly. Pauper, pauper, it clung like smoke in my lungs. Seeking distraction, I drifted into the garage. The air there smelled of oil and old books, of work done and abandoned. Rusty tools hung neatly on the wall, and shelves sagged under the weight of engineering manuals. This was where Michael had learned to build, to dream in steel and wires. The garage was a reliquary of both of us, his beginnings and my endings. A glint caught my eye, a filing cabinet in the far corner, its bottom drawer not fully latched. I hesitated, staring at it. For years I had kept it locked, tucked away as though the papers inside belonged to another life. Now in the heavy silence of grief, it seemed to beckon. I pulled it open, the metal screeching in protest. Inside lay folders thick with dust. My hands trembled as I lifted one, patent filings stamped with my name, Edward Harper, spanning years at NASA, propulsion systems, efficiency designs, concepts that had found their way into modern satellites and aerospace technology. Each page was proof of a life I had chosen to bury so that Michael could thrive without the shadow of my past achievements. Beneath the patents were bank statements, numbers printed in neat rows, accounts holding more than $12 million, accumulated quietly through royalties. Money I had never flaunted, never even revealed to Michael. The sight left me unmoored. For decades I had driven the old Ford, lived modestly, let the world think I was a man of limited means. It had been my choice, my attempt to teach Michael that worth came from effort, not inheritance. But standing there, papers spread across the workbench, I felt a fissure of doubt. Had I done right by hiding it? Had my son died never knowing that his father was not a pauper at all, but a man who had once shaped engines for the stars? The conflict surged within me. Vanessa's insult echoed again, and this time it struck differently. She had called me poor before an audience of hundreds. They had believed her because I had lived in disguise. I realized that the humiliation cut not only because of her cruelty, but because I had laid the foundation for it myself. I pressed my palms against the cool surface of the workbench, staring at the documents as if they might answer me. I was not destitute. I had never been. Yet the truth was useless if I continued to hide it. My heart pounded, not from pride but from fear. Fear that my silence had built a coffin around my legacy, that Michael's memory might be tainted by the lies of others because I had kept too many secrets. I gathered the folders and tucked them back into the cabinet, closing it with a decisive clang. The garage seemed to tighten around me, walls bending inward with the weight of revelations unspoken. For a long while I sat on the stool by the workbench, staring at the locked drawer, letting the contradiction churn. To reveal or to remain hidden, both paths felt like betrayals. Take. Then the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the stillness. I rose slowly, walked back inside, and lifted the receiver. A crisp voice introduced itself. "Mr. Harper, this is Charles Byrne. I'm your son's attorney. We need to set a date to read the will." Edward and Vanessa stepped into the law office elevator, the metallic light reflecting two opposing figures. The mirrored panels enclosed us in an intimate cage, our reflections multiplied in cold silver. My worn navy suit seemed dull beside her tailored black ensemble, each thread gleaming as if polished. Diamonds at her wrist sparked under fluorescent strips, tiny suns mocking the tired creases of my hands. We stood in silence at first, the hum of the machinery the only sound, as the elevator began its slow climb. I had promised myself to hold my posture, to grant Vanessa no further satisfaction. The insult at the funeral had burned me raw. Yet here in the polished heart of Montgomery Street, I could not allow another public humiliation. The elevator carried us upward not only in floors, but toward the revelation of Michael's will. If she tried to wound me, I would not answer. At least, that was my intention. The lobby below had been a river of dark suits and rapid footsteps, voices rising in clipped tones as mergers and acquisitions were discussed in casual fragments. Here, away from that noise, the silence pressed sharper. Vanessa smoothed her skirt, checking her reflection in the mirrored wall with the casual arrogance of one who believed she already owned the room awaiting her. Then her lips curved into that practiced smile, sweet and venomous. "You know, Edward," she said softly, "Michael only pitied you. He told me once how he felt responsible for you, like a parent caring for a child. You were his burden." The words landed like stones, heavy and precise. I felt the shift in the elevator floor as we rose, a faint tremor underfoot. But it was her voice that made my stomach lurch. My hands twitched at my sides, but I pressed them flat, staring at the panel of glowing numbers. 10, 11, 12. She tilted her head, her perfume sharp and sweet, invasive. "He loved me, not you. What you mistake for pride was just his charity. That's what happens when a man grows up with nothing. He keeps dragging it along behind him." She laughed lightly, a brittle sound, like glass struck by a fingernail. Downward, unwilling to let her see the anger threatening to break through. My gaze landed on my shoes, old leather, polished to the best shine I could manage, yet cracked along the seams. Against the marble glow of the elevator floor, they looked as out of place as I felt. A flush crawled up my neck, not from shame of poverty, but from the cruelty of her precision. She knew exactly where to press. The silence stretched. I wanted to tell her what Michael had said in his diary, the gratitude he had left me. I wanted to remind her that I had traded rockets for classrooms, space for fatherhood. But the words congealed in my throat. Pride and grief bound them together, unspoken. The elevator slowed, its mechanical groan filling the cramped air. Vanessa adjusted her diamond bracelet, victorious in her silence, as if the war had already been won. The elevator stopped at the 18th floor. The truth, waiting beyond the doors. Lawyer Byrne read aloud, "To my father, Edward Harper, I leave $30 million. Frustrations dropped into the polished conference room like stones cast into still water. For a moment, I could not breathe. My ears rang, my pulse pounded. Instead, his voice, preserved in ink, had reached out from the grave to touch me. The law office was high above Montgomery Street, its tall windows framing San Francisco Bay. Fog trailed across the water, wrapping the Golden Gate in pale shrouds. Sunlight filtered weakly through, striking the mahogany table where the will lay open. The contrast between the grandeur of the setting and the fragile ache in my chest nearly undid me. I tightened my grip on the leather chair. Across the table, James Warren and Patricia Chen sat quietly, their faces softened by grief and something else. Recognition, perhaps, that Michael had trusted them to carry forward his dream. They exchanged a glance, the kind born of shared responsibility. The company, his vision, was theirs now. Vanessa's chair scraped violently against the floor. Her perfectly manicured hand clenched her purse so tightly the knuckles turned white. "What?" she hissed. "That can't be right." Her voice cracked, panic slicing through the thin veneer of control. Charles Byrne adjusted his glasses, unflappable. "The document is clear, Mrs. Harper. All business holdings are entrusted to Mr. Warren and Miss Chen, as specified. The residence is granted to the Bay Area Children's Foundation, with your right to live there until your passing. And the financial assets, $30 million, are bequeathed entirely to Mr. Edward Harper." The silence that followed was thunderous. I felt my throat close, eyes blurring. My son, my boy who had once looked up at me with glue on his fingers, who had whispered that he would make me proud, had known. He had understood the sacrifices I had buried. He had written my redemption into law. I bent my head, tears dropping silently onto the polished wood. Byrne's voice continued, steady, formal, as he read the last lines. Michael had left me his journals, his library, his private thoughts. Proof not only of his gratitude but of his love. My shoulders shook, but it was not grief alone that moved me. It was the knowledge that I had not been invisible after all. Across the table, Vanessa's face twisted into rage. She rose, trembling, her words tumbling out in bitter fragments. You manipulated him. You poisoned him against me. This is fraud. It must be fraud. Byrne remained calm. The will was executed properly, witnessed, notarized. It will stand. Her eyes turned to me, burning with venom. You think you've won, old man? You think this is over? She leaned forward, her voice low and poisonous, her teeth bared in a semblance of a smile. Edward's tears had barely dried when Vanessa ground out each word between clenched teeth. You will regret this. I know something that will destroy you both. Edward opened the leather notebook in Michael's hand. Dad sold stars so I could fly. Shone on the first page like a small lamp in a dark room. I traced the ink with a fingertip, careful not to smudge the loops of his handwriting. The paper was warm from the desk lamp, edges curled as if the journal had been carried everywhere. Opened in airports, cafes, the backseat of rideshares. Outside the living room window, the neighborhood was hushed, porches dim, March air pressing cool against the glass. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a gentle metronome for memory. Old armchair, its cushion molded to my shape by years of late-night reading, and let the house fall silent around me. The lamp threw a modest circle of gold across the coffee table, leaving the corners in shadow. Within that warm island, I felt close to him. He had held this book. He had chosen these words. In them, perhaps, I would find a way to breathe. He wrote about the garage, how the smell of oil meant possibility, how the clatter of wrenches sounded like music when he was 10. He remembered a rocket we built from scrap aluminum that never rose more than 1.5 yards but still sent us dancing. I could see it as I read. His hair sticking up, his small hands smudged black, the grin that swallowed his face whenever something worked. He wrote about the night I told him we were moving west, leaving a promotion and a lab with my name on the door, because the schools there would be better for him. He had been so quiet then I thought I'd made him afraid. In this book, he confessed he had been stunned by the size of the gift and too proud to say so. Page after page recorded what I had never asked him to notice. The scholarships we chased, the nights I graded papers from the community college to cover the rent, the old truck I kept running with borrowed parts, the dinners of pasta and canned tomatoes when the budget was tight. He wrote of these things not as debts, but as the scaffolding of his life, the iron that let him climb. Sometimes his voice turned to plans, the prototypes, the investors, the audacity of trying to give clean air back to a choking world. He teased himself for sounding like a missionary and then dared bigger. I felt his momentum under my fingers, his mind leaping from problem to solution, the way he loved a challenge as if it were a living thing that could be soothed and persuaded. The warmth in my chest swelled until it hurt. I had come here tonight hunting for steadiness, but what I found was more dangerous and more precious, the truth that love leaves proof in ink. Near the middle of the journal, he paused to write about me directly. He left NASA when he could have stayed, Michael wrote. He traded the quiet glory of engines for the noisy hope of a child. He never boasted. He taught me to build and then stood back so I could be seen. He is my true hero. The words blurred. I pressed the heel of my hand to my eye and let the tears come, hot and unashamed. For years, I had told myself that the best sacrifices were invisible. Tonight, invisibility felt like a wound, and his recognition like a bandage lay gently across it. I read on, breathing with the rhythm of his sentences. The further I went, the more I sensed a current running under the lines, an unease he tried to ignore. He mentioned a car that seemed to idle across the street 2 nights in a row, a man who turned away too quickly when they shared an elevator, late emails from an investor whose tone had shifted from excited to urgent to strangely insistent. The entries returned to technical notes and meetings and hopes for a patent, but the small warnings lingered at the edges like a draft from a cracked window. Venophone never appeared by name, not in accusation or praise. Yet there she was, as a shadow cast by sentences that refused to say more. A dinner postponed, a silence at home. The way a voice can turn cool in a single afternoon. I did not want to fill the gaps with my assumptions, but the shape of things was hard to ignore. Still, even in the darker passages, he wrote with grace. He kept room for hope. The house around me seemed to lean closer as I turned each page. My breathing slowed. The old armchair sighed with me. When I lifted my eyes, the lamp's glow caught in the glass of framed photographs. Michael in cap and gown, Michael in a cheap suit at his first pitch meeting, Michael by the ocean, flinging stones like boyhood had never ended. In the moving shadows of those pictures, he was present enough that I spoke without sound. I hear you, son. I hear you. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the quiet. The clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, a distant car drifting downhill. I let the insult from the cathedral pass through me and out, like smoke through an open window. This book was antidote to that venom. This book told the truth. Near the end, his handwriting slanted more sharply, as if the words were trying to outrun something. The entries grew shorter, less patient with detail. Meetings stacked upon meetings. A late-night knock dismissed as a delivery to the wrong address. The sense, vague, stubborn, that attention he had not invited was now part of his days. I could feel my own shoulders rise as though bracing for a blow that had already fallen. Agent steadied the journal in both hands, the paper whispering as it settled. My mouth went dry. The lamp hummed. The neighborhood held its breath. The last line of the diary. Someone has been following me lately. The phone rang at 10 p.m. Vanessa's voice trembled. Ed, I'm broke. Her words arrived thin and breathless, as if the call were happening from the bottom of a well. I glanced at the wall clock above the bookshelf, its second hand hopping with small, stubborn leaps, and let the sound anchor me. Night had sealed the house. The furnace had clicked off an hour ago, leaving the kind of quiet that exaggerates every small thing. The tick of the clock, the faint hum from the refrigerator, the soft rasp of my own sleeve against the phone. I need help, she said. Just a little to steady things. I can pay you back. How much is a little? My voice came out calmer than I felt. $1 million, she said quickly. 2 would be safer. I'll sign whatever you want. You inherited more than enough. A small gasp, rehearsed or real, shivered across the line. Please, Ed. I'm 3 months behind on everything. The old instinct to fix, to patch, to carry more than I should, rose in me like a tide. I pinched the bridge of my nose and looked at the dark window, where the room's reflection floated like a faint double. This isn't mine alone to decide, I said. Michael's will was deliberate. He knew what he wanted done with what he left. Her tone sharpened. Deliberate. Is that what you call it? The quaver drained from her voice, leaving something metallic. You think it was thoughtful to leave me with a house deeded to a charity and nothing else? You think he meant to humiliate me? I can't speak for intentions. Only for the words on paper. A beat of silence. I heard traffic far away, tires whispering on wet pavement, and a television murmuring in a neighbor's house. You could help me, she said. You could choose to. I could, I said, but I won't. Not like this. I rested my elbow on the table, breathing carefully. This isn't about punishment. It's about honoring what Michael put in writing. Something shifted on her end of the line. The faint creak of a chair or the brush of fabric, and when she spoke again, the sweetness was gone. If you won't help, you should at least be practical. You're sitting on a fortune and a reputation that can be ruined. I know things about Michael. The room seemed to cool. What things? And who kept secrets, she said. He wasn't the saint everyone makes him out to be. Do you think investors give money without encouragement? Do you really believe all those ideas were his? You're grieving, I said, and heard how formal it sounded, how useless. This is grief talking, said softly. This is survival, I asked nicely. Now I'm telling you. Help me or I help the world see the truth. I let the silence expand because silence is sometimes the only honest answer. The clock ticked on. My palm felt damp against the receiver. In the garage, beyond 2 doors and a hallway, the filing cabinet waited with its old steel breath and its patient facts. There was truth I had kept to myself for decades, and there were truths Michael had left in his journal. I did not owe Vanessa a confession. I did not owe her the story of rockets and royalties. What I owed was steadiness. You are calling late and you are angry, I said. I will not discuss this tonight. Then we'll discuss it in public, she said, brightening in a way that did not sound like hope. Imagine headlines that don't love him. Imagine donors who don't love you. I could feel my heartbeat in the delicate shell of my ear. Good night, Vanessa. She laughed, a small, brittle ring. You think this is a choice you get to make? I ended the call. The click of the receiver landing in its cradle was louder than it should have been. For a long moment, I stood with my hand still on the phone, as if pressure alone could halt what had begun. My fingers trembled, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that a current had caught us both and was gathering speed. The house exhaled around me, wood settling, pipes ticking softly as they cooled. I drew a slow breath and let it out in an even slower one, the way I had taught Michael to do before exams, before presentations, before every moment that mattered. The urge to second-guess myself rose like steam. A million, too, and perhaps she would quiet. Perhaps the noise would stop. But I had seen how bargaining with threats only teaches threats to grow. I had lived long enough to understand that mercy without boundaries is not kindness, it is surrender. I placed the phone back on its cradle a second time, as if doubling the gesture could harden it into certainty. Glass, my reflection looked older than it had that morning. I could make out the stacked spines of engineering techs behind me, the lamp's modest glow, the neat pile of bills that had seemed important before the call and now looked like children's chores. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and fell quiet. I rolled my shoulders back, as if the motion alone could fix the weight settling there. I turned toward the kitchen to make tea, an old habit, the small mercy of heat in a cup, when a sound snapped the quiet. Take a soft click at the window. A small stone cracked the glass. At first light, Edward stepped into the yard and found his Ford F-150 sitting on 4-slash tires. The truck leaned low on its rims. A big animal felled without a sound. Rubber curled like black petals from the cuts, and a dark smear of dirt traced where the sidewalls had given way. For a long second, I only stared, the morning air pinching my lungs. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of cold Oakland morning that makes fences click as they contract and breath show like smoke. Somewhere a kettle whistled in a neighbor's kitchen. Somewhere a dog gave a single, uneasy bark. On the windshield, tucked beneath the wiper, a scrap of paper flapped in a thin breeze. I already knew what it would say. I lifted the wiper with 2 fingers as if the truck were a patient and the note a shard of bone to be removed. Block letters slanted hard across the paper. Return the money, or worse. No signature, no need for one. Take the familiar urge to swallow it, to pretend it hadn't happened, rose in me like an old habit. But the cut rubber, the knife's neat work, the way the truck settled into the gravel with a defeated creak, none of it could be absorbed in silence. I felt something pivot within me, a hinge that had not moved in years. Enough. I went inside and dialed 911, reciting my address carefully as if clarity might keep the morning from fraying. Stay inside if you feel unsafe, the dispatcher said. I looked at the truck again through the front window. I'm all right, I told her, and was surprised to discover it was true. Officer Rodriguez arrived within minutes, a woman in her 40s with calm eyes and a practiced way of looking at damage. She walked the perimeter of the truck, crouched, took photographs, measured the slashes with a small ruler she carried in a pocket notebook. These aren't random, she said, her breath puffing in the cold. Clean cuts. Someone took their time. She slipped it into a plastic evidence sleeve, then dusted the edge of the windshield for prints that wouldn't be there. Any idea who'd do this? She asked, not pressing, just opening a door I could choose to walk through. I told her about the phone call the night before. I kept my voice level as I repeated the words I'd heard. I'm broke. $1 million. 2. I know things about Michael. When I finished, she wrote quietly for a moment. Do you want to make a formal report against your daughter-in-law? She asked at last. I felt the question settle on my shoulders. Formal? Against. Words that move events from the private world of endurance into the public world of record. I looked at the truck, the faithful engine that had hauled bookshelves and ruined appliances. gotten Michael to early classes when buses ran late, carried us both across bridges under fog like wet wool. It had done its part across years without complaint. So had I. Yes, I said, I do. Lacio had begun to appear in doorways and at the edges of driveways, drawn by the uniform and the angle of the truck, by the odd gravity that damage exerts. They didn't come close, but their cautious concern brushed against me like the rustle of a small crowd in a theater. Rodriguez asked me to step to the porch table. She set the clipboard down there, smooth and deliberate, as if arranging surgical tools. We went through the details. Time I discovered the damage, the content of the note, the prior threats, the service at St. Mary's, where a single word had turned a house of worship into a coliseum. She didn't ask why I hadn't reported earlier things sooner. She had seen enough people live inside storms and call it weather. When she finally slid the form toward me, my hand trembled despite the resolve in my chest. I steadied my pen against the line that wanted my name. Signing ought to have been easy, just letters I had written 1,000 times, but I knew what it meant, to stop absorbing and start answering. The tip touched paper. I wrote Edward Harper as carefully as a man signs a birth certificate or a consent form before surgery. The ink dried quickly in the cold. To proceed, Rodriguez said softly, we'll pull nearby doorbell cams. We'll log the threat. If there are other incidents, call us immediately. Do you have a safe place to stay? Here, I said. Right horn. It also sounded true. Constrained trucked the street, the driver raising a hand in a sympathetic arc before setting to work with chains and levers. The truck's frame sighed as its dead weight lifted onto the flatbed. Rubber crumbs scattered across the driveway like coffee grounds. I felt a pang, not for the tires, but for the years stitched into that machine. The road trips to Stanford, the quiet drives home after long shifts. The Saturdays Michael and I had argued amiably about carburetors, and then laughed because the truck didn't have one. Rodriguez gave me a card. You did the right thing, she said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. When she left, a few neighbors drifted closer in the way people do when the official car is gone. They asked if I was all right, offered a ride to the tire shop, mentioned a reliable window company if I needed one later. Their kindness landed like a blanket across cold shoulders. I stood on the porch as the tow truck turned the corner, the bed flashing once in weak sun. The house felt different now. Not smaller, but more exact, as if the lines of it had sharpened. Inside, the filing cabinet would still be breathing its steel patience. The journal would still be where I left it. Outside, a choice had been made that could not be unmade. Silence was no longer my instrument. A pair of neighbors lingered near the sidewalk, voices lowered and urgent, eyes flicking from my porch to the street as if measuring the distance trouble can travel. Neighbors whispered, "Your daughter-in-law really has a problem." Perry Morrison knocked on my door with a sad smile. "Ed, I heard about it." Foreclosure carried the kind of weariness that belongs to men who have watched too many seasons turn. I stepped aside and let him in. We didn't rush to words. We let the quiet say what it could. In the kitchen, I poured coffee, and Frank held the mug the way a mechanic holds a familiar wrench. Sure, unpretending. He glanced toward the hallway where the photographs hung, then toward the door that led to the garage. "May I?" he asked. We crossed into the garage like pilgrims entering an old chapel. The air was cool and smelled of oil, paper, and mild rust. Dust lay soft on the blueprints rolled in a crate. A long-ago sketch of a bell nozzle curled at the edges on a corkboard, pins tarnished to a brownish green. The workbench was a map of my former life, calipers asleep in a wooden tray, a slide rule I could still read by touch, a tin of bolts labeled in my handwriting from another decade. We stood there for a time, listening to the faint tick of the house settling. "I remember this room," Frank said. "I remember the night we ran numbers on the secondary injector and thought we'd found a cheat code for physics." He set his cup down and ran 2 fingers across the bench, leaving clean streaks. "You could have changed the industry, Ed. I tried to change a life instead," I said. One seemed more reachable. Fueled, not with recklessness, not with pity, but with the respect of someone who has chosen duty and knows its cost. "People never understood," he went on. "They thought you left because the politics at the lab got ugly. You left because you decided a boy's future was worth more than your resume." He moved toward the metal filing cabinet in the corner, the one that breathed its slow steel breath. "Still keeping the good ghosts here?" he asked. I unlocked the bottom drawer and slid it open. The folders blinked up at us, patents, test logs, royalty statements that had stacked up like quiet snow. Frank leafed through a sheath of printouts, recognizing the shorthand we'd invented to save space in the margins. His smile grew distant and complicated. "Wait," he said suddenly. He crouched, peering into the shadowed back of the drawer, then reached beyond the folder rail. "You still have this." Federally, he pulled a compact metal box, rectangular, with a small handle and a dull red lens on one end. A grease pencil note ghosted the side. "HAR DP test, hot run, 03-17. My chest tightened. The data recorder. We had called it the black box even though it was the color of faded gunmetal. We'd used it to capture the last full-duration hot fire of the injector array before I left. "I thought I returned that to storage," I said. "You were in a hurry," he answered gently. "You gave notice, cleaned your desk, packed a boy's dreams into the bed of a truck, and you forgot that you'd slipped the crown jewel into a drawer at home, imprisoned at the box on the bench." Dust puffed into the light. With careful fingers, he opened the latch. Inside, foam cradled the recorder like a violin. There were still 2 cables coiled neatly and a narrow paper label where we used to write quick notes: combustion stability good, injector film intact, acoustic dampers within tolerance. I could hear it as soon as I read those words, the rising whine, the bass thrum, the clean, steady tone of an engine that wanted to fly. Frank found a battered adapter in a cigar tin and clipped it to the leads. He fed the line into an old monitor we kept for nostalgia and stubbornness. The screen blinked, then spilled a jagged green heartbeat across its glass, the pressure trace. Another line woke and began to hum along, the temperature curve. We stood shoulder to shoulder, 2 gray men watching younger versions of ourselves right in light. The room seemed to warm with it. Frank said, barely above a whisper, "Is proof. Not only of what you built, but of how you think. You didn't steal. You didn't flatter your way into grants. You solved, and you documented." To a timestamp, and a short audio clip crackled to life. The muffled countdown, the punch of ignition, the long, clean sustain. I closed my eyes and felt the old faith return, the faith that a careful mind and stubborn hands could turn fuel into future. When I opened them again, the lines on the screen were steady as a pulse at rest. Frank looked around the garage, then back at me. "She's going to lie," he said, not unkindly. Like a diagnosis, not a sentence. "She'll say Michael borrowed what wasn't his, that investors were duped, that your name is a costume. We both know how fast a rumor travels when it's dressed as truth." I leaned on the bench and let my hand slide over the black box. "I kept too much hidden," I said. I told myself it was humility. Maybe it was fear. "Whatever it was, it ends here." He closed the recorder gently and latched it. "The past isn't a trophy, Ed. It's a spine. Time to stand up straight." I laughed once, surprised at the sound. "You always did have a coach's tone." "A coach with receipts." He tapped the box. "We pair this with your patent trail, your royalty statements, the test logs. We show Michael's journal. We show your choices, what you gave up, what you kept, and why. We show the map, not just the destination." We felt quiet again, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but full of agreement. Dust motes drifted like slow snow in the lamplight. Far off, a freight train moaned at the edge of the city, and the sound threaded through the rafters as if reminding us that weight can be moved if the engine is willing. Frank slid the recorder into a canvas bag and cinched the strap. "I'll digitize this tonight," he said. "Multiple backups, cloud and cold storage. If a storm comes, you won't face it with anecdotes." He paused at the door and turned, his hand on the frame, his eyes the steady blue of winter sky. "If Vanessa spreads fake claims, this will be the counterpunch." Edward gathered the patents, the journal, and the recorder, and carried them to Burns' office. The receptionist waved me through, and I set the bundle on his dark wood desk, as if placing down a small engine that needed careful handling. Burn loosened his tie, slid on his glasses, and began to sort. Patents first, the official seals, the filing dates, then the royalty statements, quiet proof that ideas can keep working long after you clock out. Then Michael's leather journal, which he opened and closed with a kind of respectful economy. And finally, the data recorder Frank had restored, its dull red lens catching a bar of window light like an ember. These old papers, Burns said, tapping the stack, are not memories anymore. They are admissible facts. He picked up a yellow pad and began a list. Item 1, the vandalized truck, with Officer Rodriguez's report and photographs. Item 2, the threatening note and the late-night call. Item 3, rumors defaming Michael's work. Item 4, the expert affidavit, Frank's, verifying the authenticity of the test data and tying it to my patent trail. This is a spine, he added, almost to himself. We can stand up with this. Skinny arrived 10 minutes later, wind in his hair and a canvas bag on his shoulder. He signed where Byrne indicated, initialed margins, dated photographs, and wrote a brief statement in neat, stubborn letters about the injector array and the hot fire run. While they worked, I stood at the window and watched the bay fold fog into itself. I thought of the years when I believed that keeping quiet was the noblest form of strength. It had its season. That season was over. Byrne compiled the packet, clipped, stamped, and scanned, the rhythm of it strangely soothing. Punch, press, initial. Punch, press, initial. He dialed the clerk, then filed electronically, his fingers moving with the confidence of a man who has ferried many people across rough water. We waited, 3 men listening to a computer hum, until a soft chime announced the docket number. The court has accepted, he said. Preliminary hearing granted. Unpredict understanding in my chest. Not relief exactly, but alignment, like a door finally set true in its frame. Byrne turned the monitor so I could read the date. Frank squeezed my shoulder once and let his hand fall. A wordless promise to show up when it counted. We shook hands and gathered our coats. I slid the journal back into my bag, felt its weight settle against my side, and understood that I would carry it to the end of the story. In the elevator down, I caught my reflection and saw a man who looked older than grief, but steadier than fear. Linebacker grayed in my pocket as the doors opened. An email from Vanessa lit the screen. The subject line blank, the body a single sentence. If you keep going, the darkest truth about Michael will come to light. Bloward lay awake, reading the last page of Michael's journal. The house had settled into that late-hour hush where every small noise declares itself. The tick of the wall clock, the faint thrum of the refrigerator, the soft rasp of paper beneath my thumb. The lamp threw a cone of amber over the coffee table. Beyond it, the living room dissolved into pools of dark. On the final page, Michael had written, in a hand that leaned forward as if in a hurry, "My father's greatest value is justice." I let the sentence rest there and felt it look back at me like a mirror. Sleep would not come. I got up, paced the narrow hallway, touched the frames of old photographs, first day of school haircuts, a lopsided rocket, a graduation smile that still warmed the glass. In another life, I might have been in a lab at this hour, watching telemetry crawl across a monitor. In this one, I stood in slippers, counting my breaths, preparing to walk into a room where truth would have to wear a suit. The phone buzzed once on the table. Frank's name glowed. "You ready?" he asked, voice low. "As I'll ever be." "We've got the docket time. Byrne will meet us at the entrance. I'll carry the digitized data and the affidavit." "Thank you," I said, and meant more than the words could hold. When the line went quiet, memory brought me to the last meeting at NASA. A corner office with models of engines on clear stands, a window looking out on a field of antennae like white flowers. They had offered me a team, a budget, a future that glittered with equations. I had stared at the contract and seen a boy at a cheap kitchen table, pencil in his teeth, translating ambition into homework. I chose the boy. I signed a resignation letter with the same hand that now shook slightly over court forms. Back at the coffee table, I opened the folders and arranged them square. Patents, royalties, Rodriguez's report, the photographs of the truck, Frank's sworn statement, Michael's leather book. The rhythm of order calmed me, edges aligned, clips secured, tabs labeled.
If fear had a cure, it was preparation.
I closed the journal and rested my palm on its cover. "We'll do this clean," I said into the room, to Michael, to myself.
No bargaining with threats, only facts.
A draft crept under the window frame. I looked up, letting my eyes adjust to the dim. For a breath, I saw nothing but my own reflection in the glass, a tired man haloed by a lamp. A shadowed figure stood outside the window and then vanished. Court convened. Vanessa, dressed in black, fixed a cold stare.
He's nothing but a freeloader.
Her voice carried through the paneled room, crisp as a gavel. The gallery was full. Neighbors, investors, the merely curious, faces tilted toward us like sunflowers toward heat. Cameras winked from the press row, their tiny red lights declaring that every word would outlive the hour. I steadied my breathing and folded my hands on the table. I was not here to win a quarrel. I was here to keep faith with the truth. Judge Hartwell took the bench. Byrne rose, calm as tide, and announced our purpose. To contest the rumors, to seek protection, to move the vandalism case forward. Vanessa's attorney stood and painted a different world. A sainted son with borrowed genius, a father with a talent for self-myth, a widow pushed to desperation by an unfair will. Vanessa watched me while he spoke. The corners of her mouth lifted, as if she tasted victory already. Accusations. Michael Harper stole his breakthrough, her lawyer said. He duped investors with theatrics. The father profited from deceit. A murmur rolled the length of the room. Byrne let it settle, then opened our first folder. Paper spine, patents filed years before Michael's company existed. Stamps and dates under my name. He walked the court through the royalty trail, a steady, modest river that explained a life that looked smaller than it was. He entered Officer Rodriguez's report, photographs of the truck with its neat, deliberate wounds, the note in block letters, my recorded statement about the late-night call. He introduced Frank as an expert witness. Frank's affidavit tied the data recorder's pressure traces to the injector design in my filings, laid out in simple language how the test proved the work was mine, not borrowed, not stolen, not fog. Flames Warren testified next, voice steady, grief tamped down to duty. He described Michael's habits, how he loved to test, to challenge, to give credit. Patricia Chen followed, clear and unsentimental, confirming that investor decks referenced licensed components in original research. No one had been misled. Byrne offered the journal last, careful not to turn it into theater. He read only 2 sentences, the line where Michael called me his true hero, and the closing warning that someone had been following him. He did not speculate. He let the words be the size they were. Vanessa's lawyer objected, then objected again, but the judge admitted what the rules allowed and noted what would require fuller trial. When all voices were quiet, Hartwell folded his hands. His eyes moved from me to Vanessa and back. There is sufficient cause, he said evenly, to advance the vandalism charge and to allow the defamation claims to proceed. He signed orders for evidence preservation and a temporary protective measure. No contact, no proximity, no late-night calls dressed as emergencies. The room exhaled. I felt something align inside me, not triumph but rightness, like a joint sliding back into place. Byrne squeezed my arm once, under the table. Across the aisle, Vanessa's composure cracked, then hardened, then cracked again. She stood so fast her chair scraped. "You haven't seen anything yet!" Contagious cod. Michael Harper tied to financial scandal. I sat rigid in my chair, the television spilling its poison across the quiet room. Phones rang and buzzed. Neighbors, colleagues, even distant acquaintances, all asking if it was true. My chest ached with the weight of another wound aimed at my son's memory. Vanessa had found her weapon, rumor dressed as fact. Frank arrived first, jaw set, eyes narrowed at the headline. "She's desperate," he muttered. Then a knock, sharp, purposeful. A young woman stood there, her hair pulled back, carrying a folder thick with age. "Allison Reed," she introduced herself. "I'm with Stanford's Environmental Engineering program. Michael mentored me, but really it was you." She placed the folder on the table, opening to a faded NASA bulletin. My name, clear as ink ever was, sat above diagrams of the injector array. "This proves the design was yours, and that Michael never stole a thing. The scandal story is fabricated." Her eyes glistened. "Mr. Harper, you were the reason I chose this field. Michael told us about your sacrifices, You're the real inspiration. X. For the first time that day, the air felt breathable. Frank clasped my shoulder. I nodded, unable to find words. The phone rang again, this time the caller ID flashing San Francisco Chronicle. A calm voice. Mr. Harper, would you like to make a statement to the public? Tangled, the judge's gavel struck. Vanessa Harper is guilty of property destruction, defamation, and hereby loses all rights of residence. The courtroom erupted, reporters leaning forward, pens racing, cameras clicking in rapid staccato. All eyes turned toward me, but I kept my hands folded, steady. Essa broke, her voice cracking into shrieks. This isn't fair. He stole my life. Two deputies moved in, firm but measured, guiding her stumbling frame toward the exit as she kicked against the verdict that no longer cared. The echo of her protest trailed into silence. Judge Hartwell nodded once toward Byrne, then toward me, signaling closure. I rose, my voice clear. In honor of my son, I will establish the Michael Harper Scholarship Fund. His dream will not be stained. It will lift others higher. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with journalists and citizens. But what caught my breath was a small cluster of students holding a handmade banner. Thank you, Mr. Harper. Their voices rose above the press questions, not loud, but enough to steady me as I stepped into the light. The morning paper's former NASA engineer creates scholarship to honor late son. At Stanford, the lecture hall was transformed into a modest ceremony. Sunlight poured through tall windows, catching on the polished wood podium where I stood, holding a stack of envelopes, letters of scholarship for the first recipients. Allison Reed sat in the front row beside 4 other students, all with nervous eyes and restless hands, the way Michael once looked before his first presentation. Tech Names and Patricia were there too, quiet pillars, their pride for Michael woven into their presence. I spoke briefly about sacrifice, about choices, about the boy who had been my reason to leave rockets behind so he could find his own stars. My voice faltered only once, when I recalled Michael's words. Dad sold stars so I could fly. One by one, I handed out the letters. When Allison received hers, she held it against her chest. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she whispered, "You've given us opportunity, the same way you gave Michael." Applause rose, warm and sustained, filling the hall with something that felt larger than victory. It was release. That evening, I drove west until the ocean opened before me. The small cottage at Pacifica waited, perched above waves that spoke in endless cadence. I stepped inside, set Michael's journal on the desk by the window, and let the sound of the surf carry me into quiet. Late afternoon found me on the porch of the Pacifica cottage, Michael's leather journal resting open in my lap. The horizon burned orange and violet, the Pacific pulling the day down into its deep cradle. Each wave folded against the cliffs with a rhythm older than grief, older than memory, and yet it felt as if it moved in time with my own heart. I turned to the last page. Michael's handwriting curved across the paper, steady and certain. I have been rich my whole life because I had you. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, not heavy sobs, but a quiet stream that carried both sorrow and release. I closed the journal gently, holding it as one holds a fragile relic, knowing it contained more than ink. It contained proof that love had been seen, sacrifices understood. On the desk inside, I spread a sheet of paper and wrote slowly, the scratch of the pen keeping time with the surf. Allison, never forget, justice begins with truth. I folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it beside the journal, trusting it would find her in the right moment. The light thinned. Out beyond the porch, the waves kept arriving, one after another, relentless yet calming, echoing both finality and renewal. I sat still, listening. The journey had closed, but its current stretched forward, toward students, toward memory, toward the unseen. The sea kept its cadence. The story, too, would endure. Justice was not swift, but it arrived with the weight of truth and the clarity of law. What began as humiliation at a funeral ended as a legacy that outlived betrayal, with lies stripped bare and dignity restored. Justice may come late, but it stands like stone against the tide, proving that silence in the face of cruelty is never the final word. Sometimes it only takes one steady voice to remind the world that truth cannot be buried. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to be quick text place to Rose the text it in feature. You're about to ground the band Clary down, and you creating your stability. If you want to a service and your coachers seeing self, the white stay sad. And of you will try to visit to me, to law are down. Someone your business requires, we just as in our menus. Here the white stay, meets the white. Now, you believe the band Clary down, and you believe as a menus. Longst up the clarion sand, the way of ground and invasion of waves. Enjoyed this story? Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.